Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hi, I'm the hairball that your cat worked up and ate again, just to be rude, and which really isn't funny anymore, Kendra.
And I'm the erotic retelling of the Cliff Notes version of the Odyssey, Tony.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, that's not all that bad. It's
right?
just like
I don't think that would be
50
terrible.
Shades.
Yeah, I
It's
mean,
like the 50 Shades, yeah.
it could be worse. It could be a lot worse.
It could be a lot worse. So welcome to our podcast today, in which we discuss something totally in keeping with erotic fan fiction of the Odyssey.
That's right.
In which we are going to discuss religion in science fiction and fantasy. Didn't expect that segue, did ya?
Nope, I certainly did. Well, I did, but I would not have.
You would not have if you hadn't spent hours writing show notes with me.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have a lot on our plate today, as you guys might have an inkling. Those who are listening to this podcast may be aware that there's a lot of religion in science fiction and fantasy. We're specifically leaning more towards science fiction than fantasy in this particular podcast. I mean, that you think that's right?
I think so. Yeah.
It's more science fictional than fantastical. So we're specifically looking at religion and science fiction with a sidebar of fantasy every now and then.
Mm-hmm.
And we are going to talk about all kinds of different manifestations, whether it's, texts that were written by religious folks, and you probably have some names in mind already, texts that were written about religion or religious folks, texts that are both, as well as, texts that deal with Abrahamic religions, which is, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and other religions, completely new religions, texts that make up religions.
Yep.
And there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we've got in the lineup. I'm also really interested, Tony, this is a question that I added at the last minute, but I'm particularly interested in how religion in science fiction and fantasy interacts with queerness, given that we are ourselves somewhat interested in the intersection of science fiction and fantasy and the queer.
Yes.
So we'll get around to that question by the end of today's podcast.
Yep.
So.
Cool.
All right.
Cool.
Tony, if you had to start with
Yes.
one of those categories, which category would you start with?
I want to start with texts written by religious folks.
Okay.
And my
it's not
reason,
just because that's first in line.
it is not for that reason. No, that maybe. No. So I chose that one because it's a relatively short list as far as what I have, but there's a lot of representation here, and by representation, nope, that's not the word I meant. There are a few folks who are hard hitters in science fiction that I want to talk about that are in this category, but I also want to bring up something that some of you may be thinking about already, and that is Scientology. So, folks that are religious, folks that have created religions, here's where we're going to start. We're just gonna go for the...
Sorry, my cat just slapped me in the face.
Wow. She's ready. Are you ready?
I'm so not ready.
Wow.
Go on.
Okay.
Go on.
So, we want to talk about... Did you say I'm bleeding a little?
Yeah, she had her claws out.
Oh.
So you were going to lead with one particular author, if I'm thinking?
So I want to hit Orson Scott Card, Lois Lowry, and Madeleine L'Engle. Mm-hmm. Probably the one who we've talked most about on the podcast is Orson Scott Card, despite having devoted an entire podcast to A Wrinkle in Time way back when. But Orson Scott Card gets a lot of our ire, in particular because he is someone who has been important to the development of science fiction through the 80s, and arguably still up through now, through the last couple of decades, but has just, to us, really repulsive political, social, and personal views and values. And so it's really interesting to start with him because we dislike him so much. He was your first person to put on the show notes. So what were your thoughts? Why is Orson Scott Card kind of someone we go to with respect to religious folks writing science fiction?
Well, one of the reasons why I leapt to him is I was already thinking about, what kind of categories would we break this podcast down into, and I kind of wanted to see if there was an interesting or meaty intersection between authors who are religious and authors who write about religious people, or religious characters, I should say, because they may not be people, and whether those two groups always overlap, whether if you're religious, you're always going to write religious characters, if you bring something different to it by not being a religious author, so on and so forth. And so when I plopped that first category down, it was religious authors writing texts which may or may not be explicitly religious in nature. Mm-hmm. And I will be the first to admit I haven't read every Orson Scott Card book. In fact, it would be hard to read every Orson Scott Card book. I don't even know how he wrote all of the books he's written. He is quite prolific, and I salute that. However, the ones that I have read, which I believe are three of his books, which I kind of started with the high points and then just stopped because I don't want to get into the books that aren't as highly reviewed. Yeah. I want to keep that pristine sort of Orson Scott Card experience, and I also like to end with Speaker for the Dead as the ultimate experience with Orson Scott Card, because it's his strongest work in my opinion, and it's also the most inclusive and welcoming of diversity, and the most counter to his personal life and personal voice outside of his books. Yeah. That said, when I think of the books that I have read of his, they don't write about specifically religious people or characters. There is religion floating around in the mix, but it's not I would draw a direct comparison to, say, Mary Doria Russell, where religion is, and Jesuit missionaries are central characters. That's why I plopped him down, because it makes that distinction a little bit more clear for me. He's a religious author with very specific religious beliefs who doesn't necessarily write religious characters, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's actually an important thing to note for this category too, because presumably some of the other authors of text, some of the other creators of movies and TV shows we're going to talk about are also religious, but this category is really about those authors who make a point of making their religion public, and it's a large part of their public persona as an author or as a creator, for better or for worse. For some, I think it's really good to have that out there, and I would point to maybe G. Willow Wilson as an example of someone who is Muslim and a writer, but is also writing about, in Ms. Marvel, writing about a young Muslim superhero in the U.S. And so for her, for the writer, that is a really salient point of connection, and it's part of her public profile. Whereas I'm glad you bring up Speaker for the Dead, because in Speaker for the Dead, the fact that they're Catholics of the colony, the fact that Catholicism is such an important background for the book, kind of offsets some of what, has become kind of, or what seems to be a part of Orson Scott Card's current odiousness. Basically what I'm trying to say here is we don't dislike Orson Scott Card because he's religious or for his religious beliefs, nor do we think about any of the other authors on this list, but it's also impossible to sort of disentangle the public persona of Orson Scott Card from both his work and what he puts out there publicly.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe John Kessel wrote a brilliant sort of analysis of Orson Scott Card and how religion intersects with his work. I believe it was John Kessel.
It was John Kessel.
If you want a lengthy deep dive into the ways in which religion kind of breaks out, is specifically in Ender's Game. I highly recommend that essay. I'll find the link and throw it in our show notes when we publish. And I think one of the reasons why I wanted to throw this category together is I really did want to ask that question: can you, as a religious person, write a science fictional or fantastical text without those views, breaking out in your text? And according to the John Kessel analysis, which is brilliant, and uncovered a lot of things that I had missed, probably not.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting to interrogate a little bit.
Yeah, because I think that's true as well for A Wrinkle in Time and a lot of Madeleine L'Engle's other work, that you have, a certain kind of valuation of things that's based on religious principles. That by no means... no, that's totally not what I wanted to say. What am I trying to say here?
Shall I break in?
Yes,
and then
please.
It comes back to you. So one of the things that fascinates me about A Wrinkle in Time and the rest of the quartet or quintet, I forget how many books there were in the series, is that they're not shy about being religiously inflected. Now, the religion, the Christianity, the faith that you see in them is not preachy most of the time. But there's definitely there's no shyness about Madeleine L'Engle as she lays out. She actually takes people back into the Old Testament Bible and has frankly heretical interactions between angels and fallen angels and people, which is really interesting. But in Ender's Game, Speaker for the Dead, a lot of Orson Scott Card's sort of generation of science fiction authors, and I say that, I actually don't know how old he is, but a lot of the texts that I was reading around the same time as I was reading Ender's Game, they kind of espouse this idea that science fiction is a world of ideas, and if religion intrudes on it, it's going to be the superior religion of reason.
Yeah.
So you do see reason held up in Ender's Game as reason and logic as kind of the ultimate. And if there is religion in a card book, I would hazard a guess that it would always kind of be the religion of the most reasonable people that's in the ascendant,
Yeah.
Or that's considered the most moral. There's something weird going on with that generation of science fiction where it's kind of we're not really being religious in our science fiction. We're being philosophers, okay?
Yeah.
And yet secretly you still got this moral worldview that's shaping what's considered superior living and superior ways of thinking. Interesting.
Yeah. It's a great way to put that. So here's an author I would like to ask you about, following up on Orson Scott Card and Madeleine L'Engle, C.S. Lewis. Because I have not really read anything by C.S. Lewis except for the Narnia books, and certainly there is plenty to say about Narnia and religion and religious imagery and religious symbolism, etc., etc. But I know you're much more well-versed in C.S. Lewis, so tell me what you were thinking there.
Oh boy, am I well-read in C.S. Lewis? Yes, I am, because guess what? I'm a product of an evangelical Christian college, which means that, it's all... No, that's totally heretical to say. I won't do that. So C.S. Lewis is a modern-day prophet, is what I would say. In the evangelical Christian community specifically, his works are held as, the closest thing to Scripture in terms of, what you would read if you want to be a better Christian. So, when I talk about C.S. Lewis, I'm coming from the background of having... First of all, fallen in love with his science fiction when I was a really little kid and didn't know what I was reading. I pulled Paralandra off of the shelf of my dad that he had leftover books from when he was in college. He went to a secular college, by the way. So I pulled his science fiction off the shelf first, but then by the time I was in high school, it was very clear that Mere Christianity, A Grief Observed, a lot of his sort of hard-hitting, but brief works of nonfiction were the things that real Christians were starting to read. And then by the time I was in college, he was being taught in curriculum as a foundational core text. So C.S. Lewis he comes in gradations of preachiness. So he has his hardcore theological works that aren't even really nonfiction. They're just straight up theology. This is the reasoning of faith. Then he has another grade down from that. He has his nonfiction that is hard-hitting and has deep moments of theology in it, but isn't primarily theology. It's mostly narrative.
Yeah.
And that would be Mere Christianity and A Grief Observed. And then a gradation down from that, you have his very theological science fiction. So a couple of his books are very explicitly theology thinly guised as science fiction. And if you look at the Cosmic Trilogy, it's really interesting because they get more that way as they go along. So the third book in the series is like super preachy science fiction and fantasy. The second one is like got a chapter of preachy theology in the midst of like a really interesting science fictional narrative. And then the first one is just like science fiction, rampaging around on Mars, yay! And then Narnia is much more even-toned. So it makes sense when you look at how he wrote the Space Trilogy, the Cosmic Trilogy, as some people call it, that they'd be kind of mismatched and piecemeal, because he wrote them at very different stages of his life. But he wrote Narnia much more consistently. It was edited much more consistently, so it feels much more like a whole. But there are still moments in Narnia, like in the last battle, where you're like, oh, yeah, okay, sure, all right. We're going to roll with it, even though that's truly heretical. And that's, like, the thing about C.S. Lewis, is it's, like, the dude was bonkers. Like, he was a very deep thinker and all these things, but he was also a terrible Christian, and he was the first person to own up to it. Like, he talked about how bad he was all the time. And you read something like, The Great Divorce, where people travel into hell, but, like, for kind of vacation-ish. It's weird. It's like purgatory, but not really. It's like a modern-day Dante's Inferno, but, like, modern British dudes, like, the post-war era British dudes, like, showing up in hell, and they're like, what? I don't get it. It's super funny. I actually highly recommend reading that one, because that is, like, the weirdest C.S. Lewis. So anyway, I know a lot about C.S. Lewis. I could talk about C.S. Lewis for a long time. Maybe he deserves his own podcast or, like, a video explaining C.S. Lewis. But suffice it to say, he is most evangelical Christians' avenue into science fiction and fantasy. Specifically fantasy. So, like, he's considered safe, even though he was completely bonkers. So, like, every kid in evangelical Christian America, for the most part, is, like, free to read Narnia. And then that's, like, their gateway drug to, like, The Lord of the Rings. Because they were friends. They were inklings together. They got drunk together in Oxford all the time. So, like, it's totally safe to read Tolkien, too, even though he's a Catholic. He's, like, kind of okay, all right? So, so that was how it went for me. Like, I was reading C.S. Lewis when I was really little, like 7, and reading his science fictional works. And then I showed up in 2001 to The Lord of the Rings in theater, and then I was a goner. Like, that was my introduction to fantasy. Then I started writing fan fiction, and from there, the fan fiction took me under the deep end and introduced me to genre fiction as a whole, and to writing as a whole. And then I ended up getting a degree in creative nonfiction, because I was like, what is this? What is nonfiction? I only know how to be fantastical, science fictional. So that's the long story of how I came to be where I am now. Like, C.S. Lewis never intended for his readers to become weird-ass, queer science fiction, nonfiction writers, but that is the thing that happened, and I blame Peter Jackson for part of this, too. So
almost certainly not.
The moral of the story, if there has to be a moral, because it's C.S. Lewis, is that there are ways for people to move from, like, one sort of end of the religion end, one end of the religious spectrum in genre fiction, if we want to call it genre fiction, to, like, the far opposite end. And I look back and I'm like, you know what, I wouldn't have gotten where I am without these gateway texts or whatever. But at the same... Oh, there's a deer walking across my lawn right outside the window. Hi, deer. But at the same time, like, that's a place to start. And it's not a place to end. And I think there are a lot of people where, like, because C.S. Lewis is such a landmark author for a specific group of people, he's kind of where they start and end. And that just feels like a real shame. Like, there's a lot more out there. You don't have to be afraid to read texts that touch on different religions or take a different angle on the religion that you believe in. You don't have to feel threatened by that. And C.S. Lewis, being the person that he was, would be first in line to encourage you to use your own reason and your own faculties for analysis to judge what you enjoy and what builds your faith or builds your experience of the world. So that's my long and potentially terrible analysis of C.S. Lewis.
Well, so here's where I want to go from that. C.S. Lewis, Orson Scott Card, Madeleine L'Engle, I mentioned G. Willow Wilson as well. all of these folks have this public persona that I mentioned a few minutes ago, where their religion, their spiritual beliefs kind of are a part of that persona and inform how we read the work that they produce.
Indeed.
So if we're thinking about other authors, if we're thinking about works that do feature religion or religious characters explicitly, how does knowing something about the author sort of shape how we read that text or how we interact with that text? And I want to start us off with Tolkien, since you mentioned that, he was very involved with C.S. Lewis. He was also a rigorous Catholic. Does that change how we sort of approach The Lord of the Rings and his other works? What do you think?
That's a good question. Also, background at my evangelical Christian college, I took a class on the Inklings, and we actually did a study abroad where we went to Oxford and we traced their steps and visited the inspiration for a lot of Tolkien's work, like the Viking burial mounds in Sweden, things like that. And Tolkien is so different from Lewis, and yet at the same time, because they work together, because they were close for a period of their lives, like they get tangled up in each other's narratives and in the analysis of each other's works. I can't tell you how many biographies, collective biographies of the Inklings I've seen pop up in recent years in Christian bookstores. And so when I look back at Tolkien, it's inevitably affected by my college experience and that conflation of these religious people as a religious group, essentially.
Yes.
And I don't know that I can disentangle Tolkien now. And I'm not sure I want to. Like, again, I come to where I am by dint of going through all of the steps that I went through to get here.
Right, of course.
And I can't just wipe them off the screen and be like, I wish this didn't ever happen. I wish I never had this background in the genre. But I do have a fraught relationship with the religious part of my life. It's also influenced by how evangelical Christians view Catholics. And so that's like an additional layer of the politics that has nothing to do necessarily with what's on the page, but will affect how I receive what's on the page. By dint of the fact that I reject a lot of like the evangelical Christian background I have, that also affects how I receive things. So I'm just like a mess of confusion when it comes to interpreting or receiving texts that have a religious component.
Fair.
Often, and this is like full disclosure, I will just shut that part of my brain off and try not to be sensitive in a religious capacity to any text that I'm reading. So, but I guess it's worth noting that a lot of analysis has been carried out of how Tolkien's work is patriarchal and expresses divine hierarchies, essentially, that are pretty historically woven into the history of like Catholic faith. And so, like, I guess if I didn't know anything about Catholicism, would I have read that in? I don't even know. I don't even know if I can answer that because I did have this background. So that's a very long way of me saying, well, who the heck knows? Not me.
Right. And that's, I mean, all of those authors, with the possible exception of G. Willow Wilson, have lots and lots of critical scholarship about what they've done, endless essays and books and journal articles and whatnot, looking for that kind of like religious symbolism and religious allegory. So what if we were to consider some newer books that have come out in the last few years that are maybe by newer authors or possibly by more well-established authors, but I'm thinking here of, say, for example, the Eden series by Chris Beckett, or Wonder Blood by Julia Wicker, Quietus by Tristan Palmgren, The Hunger by Alma Katsu, A Secret History of Witches. I forget who the author of that is, but it's a pseudonym anyway, so you have that book, I believe, right now. But
I do. I have your copy of that book.
but these are all examples of books that are possibly, their author's first book or first series, and are dealing with explicitly religious characters or themes of religion, mostly themes of Abrahamic religions. So how are you affected by those, if you know something about the author versus not knowing something about the author? Because presumably for a lot of those folks, we don't know a lot about the author.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I was about to say exactly that. And I think one of the reasons why I'm able to enjoy a lot of the texts on this list, and I enjoyed almost all of the texts on this list, if not all, one of the reasons I'm able to do that is because I don't have this baggage that I've dragged with me through my whole life. and so when I look at this, like, say, Tristan Palmgren's Quietus, which tackles plague era Europe, especially Italy, in the midst of the Black Death, and you have faith and religion there, you also have aliens and interdimensional creatures wandering around. And because I don't have, like, this image of my mind of Tristan Palmgren as a person with a specific background that influences how this text was written, I am just able to ride along. Like, I'm able to just kind of roll with it in a way that I'm not able to do anymore with some of these other texts we've talked about.
Yeah.
There are moments where I'm kind of pulled out of that rolling along with it mood.
Yes.
And there were moments in Wonderblood, for example, where the ornamentation of the sentences, the ornamentation of the text itself was so dense.
Yeah.
Where I was like, oh, well, this feels more like affect than it does like you're actually writing about faith. So there are moments when I'm pulled out.
Yeah.
But for the most part, like, say, The Wicked and the Divine.
Yes.
One of my favorite comic series. It has stumbling moments when it comes to queer representation, like, fair warning to people, but it also is trying. And it's also just, like, rollicking good fun and has the most bonkers premise ever, that the gods come back every however many years, like once every generation or something, or every several generations.
Yeah, I think like 90 years or something.
Oh yeah, like once every 90 years, and then they live for 2 years. They inhabit the bodies of people who are already living.
Yeah.
And then those people die. And they're basically like rock stars. In fact, some of them are literally rock stars, in addition to being gods. And it's just such a bonkers premise, but so interesting and so fun that you just get pulled into it. And I don't honestly care like what the religious backgrounds of the various contributors are. There's there's a rotating stable of writers and artists on that. And I think that's one of the ways where I can kind of cleanse myself, or like I can move forward if I'm feeling stuck on like some element of my past, is I can just pick up a book and just like let myself sink into like the bonkers premise or whatever it is. Right. So another one, this is not so bonkers, but is definitely immersive, and I'm glad it made the list, is Kim Stanley Robbins's The Years of Rice and Salt, which is a multi-generational saga, which, again, it kind of goes back to Plague Era Europe, and it postulates, like, what if instead of 50% of the population, like 75 or 80% of the population died, and then another part of the world colonized Europe instead of Europe colonizing the rest of the world. It's not necessarily bonkers, but it's so different. And I came to that book only having read Kim Stanley Robinson's, quote-unquote, air quotes, hard science fiction. Like 2312, I think, is one of the few books that I'd read before it, and maybe the Mars trilogy, or part of the Mars trilogy. And so it was a transition from that side of my brain to the other side of my brain, and it was really pleasant. Anyway, all this to say, I think that knowing what an author's religious background will inevitably affect how I read a text. Yeah. Simply because of my background. Now, someone who, like, I'd be curious to ask you, I don't know how your religious background interacts with how you interpret text. Does it interact with how you interpret text?
There are probably so many things that interact with how I read science fiction. I am aware of the presence of religion in texts because I read them. That was such a dumb thing to say. I definitely have some familiarity with Catholicism, I went to Catholic school for a couple of years, not because my family is like we're kind of Catholic by virtue of being Italian, but everyone's lapsed.
So like culturally Catholic?
Yeah, culturally Catholic, exactly. So I'm like aware of Catholicism, but we were never really, we didn't go to church except for when we went to Catholic school, and then it was, required, something we had to do as part of going to the school for those couple of years. So I'm aware of some of the imagery, some of the allegories, some of the symbolism. When it happens, if it's done in a way that isn't obtrusive, then I generally am, like, fine with it. Like, when you started talking about Tolkien, like, I have not read Lord of the Rings to the degree that I've, like, looked for the kind of, like, Christian Catholic patriarchal structure that's there. I'm sure it is, and I'm sure, like, if I were looking for it, I would find it, or I would be guided to it by the people who have looked for it before, but, like, I try, this is going to sound terrible, but I try not to let it, like, ruin the experience for me, because a lot of the time, I find that thing kind of disappointing, maybe. Like, and this is similar to what we were talking about in the Orientalism podcast, in that so much of what seems very fantastic in science fiction and fantasy is actually kind of exploitative and only seems fantastic because it's new and it's coming from a culture or a society or something that the reader, I as the reader or another reader, is not explicitly familiar with. So I am much more interested in a work like The Years of Rice and Salt, which plays around with Eastern religions, which plays around with Christianity not being a dominant force, because Europe was not a a place of.
It was not
something.
A colonizer.
It was
colonized.
It was not a colonizer. It was a colonized, and it explores native religions and native spiritualism. For the same reason, I found A Secret History of Witches really interesting, because it kind of detailed, again, over several generations, this the coming up of Christianity in Europe over several hundred years, and the extinction of witches of I hesitate to say Wicca because I'm not using it correctly, I know, but like witchcraft kind of as a religion, and there's a word I'm not thinking of here for witchcraft, but looking kind of looking at the struggle between religions. So that kind of thing is much more interesting to me because I am kind of culturally, Catholically aware of it. But yeah, that was a long-winded answer to get there.
No, I like it. And I think I would throw 2 texts at you and see how you react.
Yeah, go for it.
Dune.
So, so Dune is, again, a text we talked about in the last episode as far as Orientalism is concerned. But that is one, if I was to hold Dune up against Lord of the Rings, for example, the religious structure in Dune is so much more obvious to me. And not just in terms of, like, the kind of, like, white savior narrative, although that is there. And, that's kind of, like, a really lazy grab for, like, yeah, Jesus was a white savior, therefore Christianity. But there's so much to do with, like, saving the heathens and bringing culture, bringing the correct way of thinking about things, and not only that, but, like, delivering upon prophecies, which is a whole other thing we can talk about. Maybe we can devote an entire episode to prophecy in science fiction and fantasy. But Dune is definitely kind of, it has this melange of Christian symbols, Christian structure. At the same time, it's dealing with, like, prophetic statements, with, like, native spiritualism, even though it's done in a really kind of hackneyed way, or what seems hackneyed now. Maybe it was great back then. Again, it's hard to tell without the proper context. But yeah, Dune strikes me as a religious text. If not primarily, then importantly. So,
the second text I'm going to throw at you.
Okay.
Can you guess?
Nope.
Dun, 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 dun.
Oh, okay. Well, I have to say I'm not super familiar with Game of Thrones. I did watch the show for the first couple of seasons, and then I lapsed, and I read the first book a long time ago. But that, too, I would say Game of Thrones falls for me. Okay, so let's return once again to the discussion we were having about Orientalism last week, and that idea that new and interesting things that science fiction and fantasy can do kind of, maybe not necessarily inevitably, but a lot of the time end up relying on what we know, because it's what we know. And that's fine, but when it's kind of exploitative and, presenting things that we don't know as new and cool and exotic and alien, that's when we can run into some problems. So I think that Game of Thrones falls kind of on the side of more problematic usage of mythical or fantastical religion, as opposed to something like, for example, The Kingkiller Chronicles, The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, or a book that we both really liked that came out this year, Starless by Jacqueline Carey. Both of those, not series, Starless is a single book and The Kingkiller Chronicles is a series, but both of those works take this idea of what's been built up in fantasy, what's been built up in real world religion for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and sort of package it in a different way. And say, okay, well, we know that there were, for example, really polytheistic religions. We know that for a long time, people from all different cultures thought that lots of things they couldn't explain were the product of, you know, the actions and behaviors of gods or spirits or beings that they couldn't comprehend. And that's very much what's going on in Starless and to a lesser degree in King Killer Chronicles. But where Game of Thrones really falls away from that for me is that it kind of lazily doesn't really explore anything. Like, you have some gods and for some societies, and that's a cool exploration. Not all societies have the same religious backgrounds. But as far as, like, the character we get, who I remember, who's, like, the only explicitly religious character, like, it just kind of seems like bog standard dark religion kind of shit, like you're birthing demons and bringing people back to life, and that's less interesting to me because it's been done so many times, and the things that are new don't really feel new as a result.
Which, speaking of new, I think it might be useful here to contrast those two works, which are problematic, and their problematicness is why I threw them at you in the first place, but contrasting them with the text, which many of our listeners will recognize as pretty foundational and prescient in a lot of ways, which is Octavia Butler's Parables duology.
Yeah.
So if you want to talk a little bit about what religion is doing in this text, especially to you, someone who's sensitive to the emergence or, I guess, manifestation of religion in a text without being, like, hung up on it like I am. Can you talk a little bit about what you see in the Parables?
The Parables are a really interesting pair of books to me because, more so than any book on this list, I think that they are actually religious science fiction. Which is not to say that they are, you know, showing off the beliefs and values of their author, or that all the characters are priests or nuns, or, you know, their equivalents. Because we certainly have lots of books on this list. We have talked about them. Where both those things and more are true. But what the Parables does really, really interestingly is that it kind of explores the emergence of a new religion. And I even hesitate to call it a religion. Like, it's more kind of like a spiritualism almost. But the idea of sort of tracing a philosophy through its origin, through the trials and tribulations it has to endure via the people who, you know, believe it, who trust in it, who don't trust in it, who are, you know, who are tempted away from it, who suffer because of it, and for many other reasons as well. This, you know, we're obviously thinking about one particular aspect of this pair of books, and then ends up, spoiler, by the end of the second book, is kind of like a legit religion, or again, at least a legit kind of spiritualism. That kind of thing is almost unique in science fiction and fantasy, as far as I've read. Are there more explorations of it? I hope so. Is this one of the best? I would think so. Octavia Butler was a fantastic writer. These books were very well recognized in the field when they came out, and they've continued to be, like you said, very foundational. But that sort of treatment of religion as, you know, not ignoring everything that's going around. All of Octavia Butler's works are very, very oftentimes uncomfortably based in current politics, what the world's like right now. And yet kind of seeing something different, being optimistic about things, and, you know, believing that this sort of exploration of one woman's philosophy can be birthed into something good, in this case a religion, is really unique and really interesting, and why they endure, even though they're difficult to read because of everything else that happens in them. But why they endure is one of my favorite series in science fiction.
Yeah, mine too. And I have to admit, like, Butler for me is kind of a mixed bag in that, like, I really enjoy some of her works, like the Parables, and I'm deeply uncomfortable with others, like Xenogenesis, for reasons which you've mentioned before. But it's also testament, I think, to just the power of those specific books, that I don't get hung up on the works of hers that I don't like. I am still incredibly impressed with the works that I do of hers. So, like, I don't get kind of, like, wrapped up in, oh, this author wrote this book that bothered me. I can't enjoy any of her stuff.
Yes.
So like that's really, really neat for me. I do have one more category for us to discuss before we start to transition out of this podcast. And that is very advanced aliens versus gods. Like, what is the line? You'll tell me the source that any science sufficiently sophisticated is indistinguishable from magic. What's the?
It's Asimov,
origin?
I think.
It's Asimov.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. So like there is something about science fiction in that like it shows science that is advanced that is conducive to also exploring religion as a consequence.
Oh, no, it was Arthur C. Clarke, sorry.
Arthur C. Clarke. No, that's okay. We still love you, Asimov. But, like, there's something about science fiction in that it does show science so advanced that it can look like magic to certain cultures, especially to, like, ours at our current state. That is conducive to also exploring religion. So I kind of wanted you to, because you threw this into the show notes, and I was incredibly impressed. I want you to talk about, again, Stargate and the Goa'uld and your Star Trek-ness.
Well, here is, when I was thinking of this, I've been aware of this particular trope for a while. It certainly is something that Star Trek played around with. Again, you guys have heard me talk about Animorphs, and I loved Animorphs, and that is something that was present there as well. That really advanced aliens that might as well be gods thing is something that's been around in science fiction for a while. But what I love about Stargate's treatment of that trope is that it tackles it full on and says, well, these aliens are not only as advanced as gods, but actually decided they were going to be gods and interact with humans as gods in Earth's history, and that so many of the gods from Earth's various cultures and Earth's history were actually Goa'uld, who were posing as gods. And I love that background for some reason, because it is both really genre savvy and also really an interesting exploration in both in two ways in which it's interesting. Those are the two ways. That's what I meant to say. And that sort of idea that aliens, the not us extraterrestrials that we're finding out there could be so advanced as to be actually godlike is something really fascinating, and I love that science fiction explores that. And there's this quote, I forget what it's from, I want to say it's Star Trek somewhere, but something about how if there's so many aliens out there that are godlike, maybe there are gods for them to be like, what's the interplay between godlike alien and god that is like alien? And some of these works definitely explore that question. Star Trek, I think, is probably the most repeatingest offender outside of Stargate, just because it's built into Stargate's mythos, so obviously it's there. In Star Trek, you have the Q, you have the Caretaker in Voyager, you have the Prophets in Deep Space Nine. Probably the Prophets are the most interesting take on that idea in Star Trek. However, I always go back to Q as kind of like, the trickster god, which was present in a lot of different cultures as well. And this quote from the episode Tapestry from Next Generation, when Picard is dead and Q tells him that he's now in the afterlife, and Q runs the afterlife, and Picard's response to him is, no, he's not dead, because I refuse to believe the afterlife is run by you. The universe is not so badly designed. And I love that. And it encapsulates kind of Star Trek's feeling for what godlike aliens tend to do when they interact with our main characters.
Mm-hmm. I do think that's interesting. And I do think, too, that there's a lot about the potential in science fiction to tackle questions of religion that we won't even really be able to touch on in detail here as we're drawing near to the end of the podcast. I would like to note, as an aside, that we've mostly focused on Western and Abrahamic religions in this particular podcast, but we want to hear from you guys, our listeners, about religions that you've seen in science fiction and fantasy, especially ones that are done particularly well, that maybe take a different angle on religion, that maybe come at it from a different background, maybe even are just completely not on our radar. So we would like to open up this conversation to you to include your suggestions. So drop us a line. We'll give you that information in a couple of minutes. And we'd like to note that we have read some really interesting texts in the last year even, that have kind of espoused very different religions and backgrounds than the ones from which we came, evangelical Christian and culturally Catholic, including Trail of Lightning by Rebecca Roanhorse, which is very interesting. We'll probably tackle that one at a later date. And also Future Home of the Living God by Louise Erdrich. Erdrich is mostly known for her literary fiction, not like science fiction, but like regular fiction. And yet she wrote this book last year, which was a contender for a top award, called Future Home of the Living God. Yeah. Another really interesting read that is inflected from very different places and peoples than the science fiction we've talked about at length here.
Yes.
But to close us out, I thought, let's just, embrace it full force. Let's go for the Jesuits, Tony.
Yeah. Yep. I knew we were going to get here.
We're going to get here. I did want to close with by reading you a quote from an interview with Mary Doria Russell, who we've mentioned earlier in this podcast. And I'm going to read it, and then, Tony, I want you to respond to it.
Okay, sounds good.
So she was asked in this interview she actually put it on... she put it on her website, but I believe it was carried out by Booksluts. Mm-hmm. And they asked her, do you think that science fiction is particularly suited to exploring questions of religion, perhaps in the same sense that legends and folktales do in other cultures? And Mary responded, well, as Stan Schmidt once said, human beings have always told stories about alien beings, but in the past they were called angels and demons and elves and trolls. Folktales and science fiction are often about what it means to be human in a large and terrifying and beautiful universe. So naturally, they overlap a good deal. As for religion, well, the great monotheistic world religions address the same concern. And if God is real and the ruler of the universe, then logically that sovereignty must extend to other worlds and their inhabitants. And that is a perfect setup for science fiction. What do you think?
I think that is a great response to her work. Because her books, The Sparrow and Children of God, again, take a completely different tack than anything else I've ever seen. They focus almost exclusively on characters who are Jesuits and their friends. The structures of the books themselves, especially The Sparrow, are pretty unique. And that worldview, that universe view, that everyone we could encounter out in the cosmos are all children of God, like the second book is titled, is really interesting and comes from the sense that I get from Mary Doria Russell as an author is that is a very unifying position, that she feels empathetic towards the aliens that she writes, and she goes about exploring them in a really non-alien way, and sort of this, we already come to the table with this commonality that she's espousing in that quote. I would actually think that worldview is very similar to, say, what Becky Chambers is doing in her science fiction, which, even though religion is a very minor element there, if it's there even at all, that same sort of empathic guidance, that we're coming to the same table and we share the same goals, we're all kind of like thinking, feeling beings, unified by something, it's numinous. It's cool. I love that it's there. I don't think it has to be represented by religion. In the case of Mary Doria Russell and what she's doing in her books, it is. But I think she's absolutely right that what she does with religion is something that other writers, other creators, other readers, other listeners have done with plenty of different things over time and continue to still do. And that kind of view of religion is really tapping into something that's very important to the way that we have told stories for thousands of years.
I think that's a great way to end the podcast. And I think it's also very upbeat and positive in that we open the podcast with problematic representations of religion, or problematic people representing or manifesting religion in their work. And we close with someone who, like me, this is what gives me hope about Mary Doria Russell. She comes from the same place as me in that she has this intensely religious background. She's got a lot of hang-ups, and she still finds a way to see the things that we share rather than the things that divide.
Yes. Yes,
and
exactly.
and Becky Chambers is doing the same thing with her found family narratives.
Yes.
And that's brief promo. We're going to do a found families episode at some point in the near future.
Soon.
This podcast, which is awesome. So, but there's a synergy there in that
Yes.
Chambers, Russell, even Butler, even though she's a bit more of a pessimist about like the ultimate fate of humankind, but like even Butler, like they're tackling what are the common threads that hold us together, what makes us tick, and makes us draw closer to each other. And
Yes.
religion is one answer,
Yes.
as you so eloquently put it, and there are other things that do this as well. So we're gonna keep kind of like tickling at the edges of this conversation in future podcasts. And thank you, Tony, for such a great sort of conclusion there.
Thank you for offering it. Yes.
So thank you for coming along on this wild ride in which I talk about all of my childhood traumas and why I'm so nervous about doing this podcast. I was incredibly nervous about doing this podcast. I hope it's been good.
Yeah, it's been great.
I hope that I can have more rational conversations about religion in the future.
We'll revisit it for sure.
Yeah. So we'll keep coming back to it, and we're actually hoping to dedicate an entire episode at some point to Mary Doria Russell as well.
Yes.
So there will be more. There will be more. But in the meantime, Tony, we have a pretty good idea of what we're going to talk about next week, don't we?
We do. Yes, we do.
What's it going to be?
Gay.
We're going to be gay.
Yeah.
I mean, we're already gay, but we're going to talk about it in
Yeah.
the context of science fiction and fantasy. It's going to be great.
Yep.
So you can look forward to a podcast about very queer things in science fiction and fantasy next week.
Yep.
Tony,
Yes.
if they're interested in listening to next week's episode, where can they look for updates and to hear more about our podcast?
So if you want to know what's going on in the lives of the Imaginaries, our Twitter is going to be where you're going to go for that info. Imaginary_pod. Also, check out our website, which we update at least weekly, I would say. That is at imaginaries.net. If you want to check out what we're releasing, that's always on SoundCloud and iTunes, or wherever you download your podcasts. YouTube has all of our back episodes, and also I can finally announce that we've branched out and are doing videos on YouTube as well, not just of our back podcasts, but of entirely new material. The first video is all about what the Federation is in the Star Trek universe, and there are more videos to come. They may be up by the time that this podcast is out, so check that out. They're on our same YouTube channel. Just look for The Imaginaries. And if you are interested in shooting us an email for whatever reason, maybe you want to fill it with cat gifts. That's totally cool. We're down with that.
Definitely not hairballs. Please.
Yes, no hairballs though. Then you can reach us at our email, which is, I always forget.
Imaginarypod@gmail.com.
Thank you.
No underscore.
Imaginarypod@gmail.com.
It's true. And Tony, I hope this is okay with you, but I created a new playlist for your videos.
That's
on
great.
YouTube.
That's what I was figuring.
And the playlist is titled Imaginary Guides to Science Fiction and Fantasy. So check it out. It's gonna be great.
Check it out.
Yep. So thank you and
good night. Bye.